Hey guys, tonight we're tracing something quietly miraculous, the world's first libraries. You're stepping into a world of damp clay, flickering oil lamps, and the distant trickle of the Tigris. Picture yourself walking barefoot across cool, packed earth. The air smells faintly of smoke and wet soil. Around you, figures move with deliberate calm, pressing sharp reeds into soft tablets. They murmur softly to one another, not in gossip, but in cuneiform. And you, standing there in the thick Mesopotamian dusk, realize you're watching humanity begin to remember itself. You probably won't survive this, at least not in body. We're about 5,000 years back after all, but your imagination will do just fine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you do, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always fascinating to see who's drifting off from where in the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along a muddy path beside the Euphrates, past low clay houses and the faint sound of goats. The horizon is the color of baked pottery. Somewhere nearby, a scribe leans over a tablet, his stylus tapping like rain. You can almost hear the quiet scratch, tiny wedges pressed into wet clay, each mark a thought pinned to matter. This is where libraries are born. Not in marble halls or scroll-lined chambers, but in messy record-keeping. The earliest libraries weren't designed for readers like you. They were warehouses of order, grain counts, temple offerings, lists of workers, and, if someone had a sense of humor, maybe a few prayers asking the gods for less paperwork. Still, in those stacks of tablets, history begins to hum. You duck into a small, dim room, probably the back chamber of a temple. Shelves made of sun-dried brick line the walls, and hundreds of tablets sit there, each etched with lines of neat wedges. They're heavy, solid, and infinitely patient. No parchment to rot, no ink to fade, just clay and time. You reach for one, and your fingers leave a faint trace of oil. The scribe who made this lived 4 millennia ago, but his fingerprints are still pressed into the back. That's the secret charm of these first libraries. They were both fragile and immortal. A flood could wash them away, but fire could bake them hard, turning them into stone. Historians still argue whether this strange accident of chemistry is what truly preserved civilization's earliest records. Whether we owe the birth of history to a few lucky fires. You tilt your head and read the faint signs, if you could call it reading. The language is Sumerian, one of the oldest we know. Cuneiform looks more like geometry than writing, all little wedges angled just so. Cuneus means wedge in Latin. Later scholars named it long after it stopped being spoken. Each tiny line tells of a world that believed writing was divine. Words were a gift from the gods, specifically from the scribe deity Nabu, who was basically the patron saint of "please don't smudge my work." You imagine the scribes training in temple schools, copying signs over and over, like ancient typists with sore wrists. The stylus itself, usually a trimmed reed, was their tool of choice. Some scholars even believe different stylus shapes indicated rank. The sharper your reed, the higher your pay grade. And just like that, humanity invents both literacy and office politics. Nearby, a boy delivers fresh clay tablets on a wooden tray. He glances at you, curious. You're not dressed like anyone he's seen. He shrugs and goes back to work, setting the tablets near a brazier to dry. The smell of baking clay fills the air, earthy and warm. You can almost feel it vibrating with meaning, this idea that words can outlast breath. A mainstream historical fact slips quietly in. The oldest known library we found is at Ebla in modern-day Syria. There, Archaeologists uncovered around 17,000 tablets dating to about 2500 BCE. That's not a typo, 17,000. Bureaucrats, it seems, have always loved their paperwork. But among those tablets were myths, hymns, and linguistic dictionaries. Yes, the ancients had study guides. Some even believe the world's first recorded creation myth was archived there, a kind of pre-Genesis story describing how gods molded humans from clay. You can almost hear the scribes chuckle at their own irony, writing about clay while writing on clay. And then there's the quirky part. These early libraries sometimes doubled as recycling centers. Old tablets could be soaked, reshaped, and reused. Imagine erasing entire epics to make space for tax records, something that would horrify every modern librarian. Somewhere in that mud, Gilgamesh himself might have been overwritten by barley counts. Still, not everything vanished. Some scribes hid practice tablets behind walls or under floors. These accidental time capsules became our greatest finds. That's how the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's first great story, resurfaced after 3,000 years, thanks to a pile of forgotten notes a student probably meant to throw out. You wander through another chamber. Light flickers from an oil lamp, its flame curling upward like a slow breath. On the walls, you notice faint impressions of reed mats and handprints, echoes of the people who lived, worked, and probably complained here. You realize that the world's first libraries were not built for beauty. They were built to remember. Historians still argue whether the Sumerians themselves thought of these places as libraries. The word didn't exist yet. To them, these were tablet houses, parts of temples or palaces where knowledge slept between uses. The idea of reading for pleasure, or reading at all without a priest's permission, would take centuries to bloom. But this is the seed. You sit down beside a low shelf, the ground cool beneath you. The air hums with quiet activity. Someone outside is shouting about oxen. Another voice chants an offering list. And inside this still room, you notice how the tablets themselves seem alive, breathing softly through time, whispering through cracks. You pick one up, it's heavier than expected, and on its surface, faint signs shimmer in the lamplight. A fragment reads something about grain rations and temple workers. Another side contains what looks suspiciously like an ancient complaint letter. Yes, those existed. One tablet from around 1750 BCE is basically the world's first customer service rant, someone furious about bad copper shipments. Bureaucracy, older than love songs. And maybe that's what makes it oddly comforting. For all the grand myths about kings and gods, most of what humanity first chose to preserve was astonishingly ordinary. Taxes, receipts, inventory lists, the heartbeat of everyday survival. There's something quietly beautiful about that. Outside, the moon rises above the plain. You can almost hear frogs in the marshes. The air cools, and a light breeze carries the smell of river silt. Somewhere far off, a scribe sighs and stretches his cramped fingers. Tomorrow, he'll start again. Hundreds of new tablets, dozens of new marks. He doesn't know it, but he's building the foundation for everything from your local library to your phone's note app. You glance back at the shelves one more time. They stand steady, silent, and eternal. Each tablet is a heartbeat preserved in clay. You wonder how many more layers of history rest beneath your feet. Stories still unread, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. And in that moment, as your eyes grow heavy and your breathing slows, you understand. Memory begins here, pressed into mud by tired hands. The first libraries weren't built to impress, they were built to endure. You leave the dim storeroom behind and wander deeper into the temple complex. The air thickens with incense, and somewhere close, a priest is chanting softly, a rhythm older than most nations. The sound echoes against walls painted with fading murals of gods who watch but never blink. You follow the flicker of a torch, the slow shuffle of sandals on clay floors, and realize you've stepped into one of humanity's first sanctuaries of organized knowledge. Temples, here in Sumer, are not just places of worship. They're the centers of everything: religion, politics, economics, even education. And tucked inside these sacred compounds, in side rooms smelling faintly of baked earth, are the first archives, the spiritual ancestors of the world's libraries. The Sumerians called these temple storehouses the Adaba, literally tablet house. You can almost picture the ancient equivalent of a librarian, a scribe priest with ink-stained fingers and the weary patience of someone who's been correcting other people's clay since dawn. You step carefully between shelves made of mud brick. The light comes from small lamps perched on ledges, each with a flame that wobbles like it's breathing. The heat makes the air shimmer. On one wall, stacks of tablets are arranged in neat columns, each labeled by topic: grain taxes, livestock, hymns, omens. The organization isn't alphabetical because, well, the alphabet hasn't been invented yet. But the intent is there. That's the mainstream historical fact here. Sumerian temples doubled as early archives, with entire sections devoted to record keeping. The priests didn't just pray. They balanced ledgers, tracked land ownership, and chronicled everything from flood seasons to offerings. Some scholars say these temple libraries were the first true bureaucracy, proof that divine order and paperwork go hand in hand. You lean closer to one of the tablets. Its surface glints where the light hits. The text, if you could read it, might tell you who brought goats last week, how many jars of barley were delivered, or who forgot to make their temple payment. Every transaction, every whisper of trade, every ritual offering, it all ends up immortalized in clay. And because these were the days before recycling bins, there's a decent chance the scribes sometimes used the backs of older tablets to draft shopping lists or practice cuneiform doodles. One quirky tidbit historians love: among the temple tablets discovered at Uruk and Lagash, some record not just temple offerings, but gossip. Yes, gossip. There are tablets that mention arguments between priests, fines for drunkenness, even rumors about temple staff borrowing livestock. So, the world's first libraries, part holy archive, part workplace drama log. You can almost imagine someone whispering, "Don't let Enlil know I wrote that." A group of apprentices scurries past you, each carrying a wet tablet balanced on a flat board. They move toward a courtyard where a fire pit glows faintly. This is the drying area. You follow them out into the warm night. The stars above shimmer like flakes of silver pressed into black clay. You watch the apprentices kneel to line up their tablets, careful not to smudge a single wedge. They're barely teenagers, most of them, and their eyes have that glazed look of anyone who's been overworked and underappreciated for centuries. The first library interns. One boy catches you watching and grins faintly before turning back to his work. He's humming under his breath, a melody you can't place, but it sounds like concentration given sound. Each mark he makes is a quiet act of permanence. You feel the air hum around him, as though the universe itself pauses to listen. Historians still argue whether these temple collections were meant for preservation or merely convenience. Were they libraries in the sense of shared knowledge, or just ancient filing cabinets? Some believe the priests thought of these archives as part of the temple's sacred machinery. To know was to control, and to control was divine. Others see in them the beginnings of something far more human, the instinct to hold on to information simply because forgetting feels dangerous. You step back inside, into a smaller chamber. It smells faintly of sesame oil and smoke. There's a wooden box in one corner, filled with broken fragments of tablets, shards of stories and data alike. You crouch beside it, running your fingers over the sharp edges. It feels oddly modern, like a corrupted hard drive. Bits of meaning scattered beyond repair. Still, one piece catches your eye, a curved fragment showing the faint outline of a bull and some neat cuneiform text beneath it. If your Sumerian weren't so rusty, you'd know it's a list of livestock offerings from the city of Nippur. Archaeologists found thousands of these in temple ruins, each one cataloging the temple's income, expenses, and divine IOUs. It's possible that the priests who managed them were among the first accountants, and possibly the first people to hate math homework. You imagine the daily rhythm, dawn prayers, incense smoke curling upward, the rustle of reed pens on clay, and the constant muttering of priests checking their records. The temple itself feels alive, like a beating heart of knowledge. Outside, farmers bring offerings and pay debts. Inside, scribes immortalize every goat and grain. One priest, his head shaved and robe smudged with clay dust, leans over a tablet and mutters to himself. He glances at you, his expression unreadable, as if wondering whether you belong here. His eyes flicker to the shelves where hundreds of tablets gleam softly. Then, without a word, he turns back to his work. You realize this is what reverence looks like. Not chanting, not kneeling, but recording. You move through the next corridor. The walls are lined with plaques depicting gods holding writing tablets. The Sumerians genuinely believed the act of writing was sacred. To write was to echo divine creation, the word shaping the world. One of the inscriptions you pass describes the goddess Nisaba, the patroness of writing and wisdom, who kept her own celestial library. You can't help but smile at that thought. Even the gods needed to stay organized. And then another quirky detail surfaces. Some archaeologists believe temples used clay envelopes, small hollow shells that enclose tablets to seal deals or prevent tampering. Imagine mailing a letter made entirely of mud. To open it, you'd have to smash it, literally breaking the seal of trust. The world's first security system, and probably the first complaint about clay spam. Outside, thunder rumbles faintly across the plains. You feel a cool draft enter the room, stirring the lamp flames. For a moment, you think about how much of this knowledge will vanish. The temples will crumble, floods will come, empires will rise, rename the gods, rebuild, and collapse again. And yet, here you are, thousands of years later, reading their ledgers. The priests would be both horrified and proud. You reach the doorway again, looking back one last time at the rows of tablets, silent as sleeping monks. Somewhere in this collection, between the tallies and temple decrees, lies a simple line about a farmer named Lugal who delivered 3 baskets of barley and 1 slightly unimpressed goat. You can almost hear him sighing as he walks home, unaware that his mundane transaction will outlive him by 5,000 years. It's humbling, isn't it, that what people preserve first are not their glories, but their chores. Maybe that's what keeps civilizations grounded, the knowledge that even the divine needs someone to take inventory. You step back into the courtyard, the temple glowing like an ember against the night. The air feels heavier now, thick with memory. The wind lifts a trace of dust from the ground, and for a moment, you could swear it carries whispers, the voices of those long-dead scribes, their prayers and ledgers merging into one continuous hum. As you walk away, your sandals brush against the soft earth. The moon glints off something half-buried, a cracked tablet fragment, its marks still visible. You pick it up, brush off the dust, and smile. The grooves catch the moonlight like tiny rivers. You can't read them, but somehow you understand. The temple stands behind you, watching, guarding. Inside, the priests continue their eternal work, tending not just to gods, but to memory itself. The first libraries of the world breathe quietly in the dark, waiting for someone like you to listen. You've left the Sumerian temples behind now, following the slow drift of centuries down the rivers and across the dust. The world has changed, though the air still smells faintly of clay and smoke. You're in the shadow of Nineveh now, once the beating heart of the Assyrian Empire. The city rises from the plain like a mirage of brick and power. Its walls stretch wider than sight. Carved reliefs show lions, kings, and too many beards to count. And somewhere inside, the world's largest collection of clay tablets waits in patient silence. The palace of Ashurbanipal stands at the center, massive and gleaming in the sun. The king himself, yes, the same Ashurbanipal who bragged about reading every text in existence, is inside, surrounded by scribes who probably wish he'd stop making them stay up late. You walk toward the entrance, through gates guarded by enormous winged bulls. Their stone eyes follow you, unblinking. The air hums with the low, vibrating sound of empire. Inside, it's surprisingly quiet. The echo of your footsteps stretches down corridors painted with scenes of conquest. Chariots charging, spears gleaming, lions mid-roar. You feel slightly out of place because you're not here to see war trophies. You're here for something far more peaceful, though arguably just as powerful. In one of the inner halls, past rooms filled with incense and murmuring attendants, you find it. Shelves upon shelves of tablets, thousands of them. They line the walls, fill baskets, cover tables. The air is heavy with the dry, dusty scent of baked clay. You step closer, running your fingers along a row of neatly stacked tablets. Each one is a heartbeat from 650 BCE, a word, a thought, a record frozen in time. Here lies the Library of Ashurbanipal, the greatest treasure house of knowledge in the ancient Near East. Over 30,000 tablets have been found here, each pressed with wedge-shaped marks. They include everything from royal decrees to omens, hymns, mathematical tables, medicine, myths, and even letters complaining about bad omens before breakfast. The mainstream historical fact is simple but astounding. This was the first known royal library with the explicit purpose of collecting all human knowledge. Ashurbanipal wasn't content to just rule. He wanted to read, study, and archive the world. He sent scribes across the empire to copy texts from Babylon, Sumer, and beyond. His goal was both scholarly and political. To possess knowledge was to possess power. But of course, he wasn't humble about it. The king's inscriptions describe him as the one who has learned the art of the scribe. He boasted that he could read Sumerian, Akkadian, and the obscure words on the tablets of before the flood. You can almost hear the tone, equal parts pride and overachiever energy. Somewhere, his librarians probably rolled their eyes behind his back. You wander down one of the long aisles. The tablets are grouped by subject. To your left, medicine and healing spells. To your right, astronomy and omens. Farther down, an entire section devoted to the myths of ancient Mesopotamia. You pick up one and squint at the markings. It's part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the very version that modern archaeologists would one day uncover in these same ruins. Imagine that! The world's first great epic, hidden in the world's first great library, only to be rediscovered 2,500 years later by curious humans in dusty hats. Somewhere behind you, a scribe coughs softly. You turn and see him hunched over a fresh tablet, stylus tapping in rhythm. His fingers are caked with dry clay. He doesn't notice you, lost in the trance of creation. Every few moments, he stops to squint at an older tablet before copying the next line. This, you realize, is how knowledge survived before printing, through painstaking human endurance. Every copy made by hand, every word dependent on a steady wrist. The light in the hall is dim, filtered through narrow slits high in the wall. Dust motes drift lazily through the beams. The soundscape is hypnotic. The soft tap of styluses, the crackle of a distant fire, the faint whisper of clay rubbing against clay. You breathe slowly, letting the rhythm pull you deeper into the past. And then a quirky detail. Archaeologists found small clay tags in this library, essentially ancient labels attached to tablet bundles with string. Each tag listed the tablet's title and opening line, like a primitive index card. So yes, the world's first metadata was baked in literal clay. Ashurbanipal might not have had Wi-Fi, but he absolutely invented tagging. The king himself, historians say, often visited the archives. He wasn't the dusty academic type, though, more like an obsessive collector. Some tablets even bear inscriptions that say, "Property of Ashurbanipal, King of the World." You can almost picture him walking around, pointing dramatically at stacks of tablets while his scribes quietly die inside. But not everything here is organized perfection. In one corner, you find a basket labeled, in your imagination anyway, miscellaneous. Inside are fragments, broken tablets, duplicates, and partial translations. Some are from conquered cities, others were likely misfiled. You pick up a shard and notice the faint trace of a different dialect, Akkadian merging with Babylonian. The empire was multilingual, and its knowledge reflected that chaos. Historians still argue whether Ashurbanipal truly understood all the texts he collected. Did he read them, or simply hoard them like an intellectual dragon guarding his hoard of tablets? The evidence is fuzzy. Some letters hint that scribes struggled to interpret the older Sumerian records, which by then were already ancient to them. It's as if they were reading the equivalent of hieroglyphic poetry from 1,000 years before their grandparents were born. You move deeper into the archives. The scent of dust grows thicker. You pass a wall carving showing scribes presenting tablets to the king. His hand is raised, perhaps in blessing, or maybe in correction. The faces of the scribes are carved with a kind of resigned devotion. You can almost hear the unspoken mantra, "Please, no more revisions." And here's where the story takes a turn, because one day these shelves will fall silent. When Nineveh burns in 612 BCE, brought down by a coalition of enemies, the palace will crumble, the wooden shelves will collapse, and the clay tablets will rain down like shattered stars. Fire sweeps through the halls, but instead of destroying them, it bakes them. The flames that erase the empire preserves its memory. Those same baked tablets will lie buried for over 2,000 years, waiting patiently for modern archaeologists to stumble upon them. It's one of those ironic twists history seems to adore, destruction as preservation. You can almost imagine the ashes settling, the city cooling, and the tablets sleeping beneath rubble, quiet, unbroken, eternal. Centuries later, when Austin Henry Layard digs through the ruins in the 1850s, he finds these tablets and unknowingly resurrects the first great library. The letters of kings, the myths of gods, even recipes for healing, all emerge from the dust. Some still bear Ashurbanipal's boastful inscription, "Whosoever shall carry off this tablet, may Ashur and Bel curse him." You grin slightly. Even in death, the king was possessive about his collection. You pause at the doorway, turning back for one last look. The shelves stand in neat, solemn rows, bathed in fading light. The air feels charged, like static before a storm. Somewhere behind you, you hear the faint clatter of clay, a tablet falling, or maybe just your imagination. Either way, it's a reminder that every empire eventually slips into silence, but the words they pressed into the earth somehow endure. The Library of Ashurbanipal is more than a monument to scholarship. It's a whisper from humanity's collective memory, a promise that even in collapse, the will to record survives. You step out into the sunlight again. The city hums with life, vendors shouting, soldiers marching, the smell of dates and dust. You glance back at the palace, its walls glittering like gold dust in the heat. Inside, thousands of tiny wedges sleep in perfect order. They'll outlast the king, the empire, even the language itself. And as you walk away, a small, half-joking thought crosses your mind. Somewhere out there, in the sands of Assyria, the world's first overdue library fees are still uncollected. You move forward through time, stepping carefully over the centuries that crumble like dried clay beneath your feet. The kings of Assyria are long gone, their palaces collapsed, their tablets half buried beneath the slow patience of the desert. But their writing, those little wedges of thought, has survived. Now you're standing in the quiet heart of a modern museum, though the story unfolding here belongs to long before glass cases and polite whispers. It's the story of cuneiform itself, the wedge-shaped alphabet that once held the weight of entire civilizations. You stand in front of a display case that glows softly under white light. Inside, a handful of clay tablets rest like sleeping animals. Their surfaces shimmer with marks, dense, orderly, and utterly alien. They look almost like code, tiny parallel lines pressed at careful angles. You lean closer and imagine the sound of styluses tapping, the heat of ancient air, the smell of drying earth. You can almost feel the rhythm of the scribes' work, an unbroken heartbeat across millennia. The name cuneiform comes from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. Not exactly poetic, but practical, much like the system itself. Each symbol is made of a few short strokes pressed into the clay at different angles. With just a stylus and a lump of mud, a scribe could record a king's decree, a poem, or even a dream. Over 5,000 years ago, this was humanity's shared hard drive. Thousands of tiny clay memory cards, baked by time. Historians still argue whether cuneiform was truly an alphabet or something more complex. It wasn't letters in the way you know them, but syllables and pictographs gradually abstracted into sound. To the untrained eye, it looks impossibly dense, but to a skilled scribe, each wedge carried a story, an instruction, a prayer. In the ancient city of students would copy lines of text on clay tablets for hours, erasing and rewriting until their fingers were raw. The Dubba, the tablet school, was both a classroom and a forge for civilization. Imagine the clatter, the soft slap of wet clay, the sharp clink of reeds against stone benches. The instructor pacing behind rows of students, peering over shoulders, correcting strokes. One boy yawns, another smears his work by accident and groans quietly. Some things, you realize, never change. Ancient homework still carried the same existential despair. And here's a quirky tidbit that brings that world alive. Archaeologists have found practice tablets with doodles in the margins, little sketches of animals, stick figure gods, or just random marks of boredom. Even 4,000 years ago, humans were drawing in the corners instead of paying attention. Somewhere, an ancient teacher probably sighed and muttered the Sumerian equivalent of, "You'll never get into Nipper University at this rate." The more you learn about cuneiform, the more miraculous it feels. It started around 3200 BCE as simple pictographs used for accounting: sheep, grain, jars of oil. and slowly evolved into a system capable of expressing thought itself. It was flexible, durable, and gloriously bureaucratic. One historian called it the spreadsheet of civilization, which feels right. If you wanted to know who owed the temple 10 goats, cuneiform had you covered. But the magic came when people realized it could also tell stories. The world's first literature was carved in this script. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Descent of Inanna, hymns to the goddess Ishtar, love poems, and laments. What began as an accounting trick turned into poetry. You picture a scribe somewhere in Uruk, pausing mid-record to wonder whether humans could write about more than barley and taxes, and then doing exactly that. Still, for modern historians, decoding those marks was like solving a puzzle made of silence. When cuneiform disappeared around the 1st century CE, no one remembered how to read it. The script slept for nearly 2,000 years, buried in ruins, waiting for someone curious enough to listen. You close your eyes and imagine the scene centuries later, 1835, in a place called Behistun in modern Iran. A British officer named Henry Wallenson, armed with more enthusiasm than self-preservation, climbs a sheer cliff face to copy an enormous inscription carved into the rock. The text, written in 3 languages, will turn out to be the key to unlocking cuneiform, just as the Rosetta Stone did for Egyptian hieroglyphs. Hanging hundreds of feet in the air, Rawlinson scribbles furiously, probably questioning every life choice that led to this moment. Years later, scholars gather to compare translations. Slowly, wedge by wedge, they begin to hear ancient voices again. The kings of Assyria speak. The scribes of Babylon sigh. The myths of Sumer breathe once more. One tablet, excavated from Nineveh, contains the flood story from Gilgamesh, eerily similar to the biblical tale of Noah. Historians still argue whether one inspired the other, or if both were born from the same memory of ancient catastrophe. But either way, the echo is unmistakable. You smile faintly at the thought. The oldest known flood story, written in a language long dead, survives because someone once pressed it into clay. Not ink, not paper, clay. It's humbling to think that the first storytellers built their libraries out of mud. You walk along the museum display, the lights dimming slightly as evening filters through high windows. Each tablet feels like a heartbeat preserved. You imagine how heavy they were, each one weighing a few pounds. Knowledge wasn't light in those days. It demanded effort. You didn't just download a text, you baked it, literally. Here's another delightful quirk. Ancient scribes sometimes signed their work. In cuneiform tablets, you'll occasionally find lines like, "Copied by the junior scribe Nabu Iddin for the glory of the temple." It's part authorship, part insurance policy. If the tablet turned out wrong, the blame was neatly baked in. You take a seat on a nearby bench and close your eyes. The sounds of the museum fade, replaced by the imagined hum of an ancient library, the scratching of reeds, the sighs of students, the crackle of drying clay. You picture yourself among them, your stylus poised above the soft surface. The clay is cool beneath your fingers, yielding but firm, like memory itself. Each stroke you press feels like breathing a little permanence into the world. Then you open your eyes again, back in the stillness of the present. The tablets behind the glass haven't changed. They've been waiting for thousands of years, and they'll wait thousands more. Cuneiform survived floods, conquests, and neglect. It outlived kings, languages, and the cities that birthed it. When Ashurbanipal's palace fell to fire, the flames baked his tablets into stone. When the deserts swallowed the ruins, the clay kept them safe. Historians still debate whether cuneiform was the world's first organized cataloging system. Some claim the Assyrian archives count, others argue it began in Sumerian temples. But really, the debate misses the point. What matters is that from the moment humans began pressing thought into clay, they began building something astonishing: continuity. The first libraries weren't just collections of words. They were conversations between the living and the yet-to-be born. You run your hand lightly along the glass, tracing the outline of one tablet's edge. The wedges seem to shimmer slightly, like tiny constellations. You realize you're staring at the fingerprints of someone who lived 50 centuries ago. The same hands that fed goats, prayed to forgotten gods, and dreamed beneath the same stars pressed these marks into being. The thought lingers as your breathing slows. Maybe that's what the first libraries really were. Not rooms or shelves, but promises. A promise that memory could survive the body, that stories could be stronger than stone, that even in silence, humanity could find a way to keep whispering forward. The wind shifts, and with it, the scent of earth and river changes. You've crossed a threshold in time and place. The hard lines of Mesopotamian clay soften into the wide shimmer of the Nile. The air is thick with sunlight, diffused through reeds and the slow rhythm of water. You are now in Egypt, land of stone and sky, where writing is not merely a tool, but a sacred act. The Egyptians had a phrase for this: Per Ankh, the house of life. It was both a library and a temple, a place where words were alive, vibrating with power. Every scroll stored within its cool stone walls was more than knowledge. It was a fragment of divine order, a thread in the fabric of eternity. To write was to create. To read was to remember the gods. You step into the shade of one such house of life, somewhere deep within a temple complex. The entrance smells faintly of papyrus and oil lamps. Inside, the air hums with quiet concentration. Scribes sit cross-legged along long wooden tables, their hands steady, their faces calm. Thin brushes glide over strips of papyrus with a sound like whispering reeds. The light from narrow windows falls across baskets of scrolls, neatly tied with cords, labeled in ink that has faded to brown. At first glance, it looks like a small archive, but to an Egyptian, this is something greater. This is a vault of immortality. In Egypt, writing wasn't invented out of necessity the way it had been in Sumer. It was born out of reverence. The first hieroglyphs appeared not to count grain, but to honor gods and kings. Hieroglyphs, literally sacred carvings, were believed to have been given to humanity by the god Thoth, the scribe of the gods, the keeper of wisdom, and the one who measured time. Every word written was an echo of his divine art. You watch a priest scribe dip his brush into ink made from soot and water. His strokes are elegant, slow, deliberate. He's copying a hymn to Osiris, the god of the underworld, ensuring that the right words accompany a pharaoh into the afterlife. A single misplaced sign could disrupt the soul's journey, so the scribe works as though his hand were guided by the divine. In a sense, it is. A boy enters the room carrying a small basket filled with newly made papyrus sheets. He bows slightly before placing them on the table, careful not to disturb the work in progress. You follow him out, curious about how these fragile sheets are made. Beyond the temple, near the riverbank, the world brightens again. Men stand knee-deep in the Nile, cutting tall green reeds. The papyrus plant, Cyperus papyrus, is everywhere, its feathery tops waving lazily in the breeze. Each stalk is sliced open, its inner core cut into thin strips. Those strips are laid side by side, then cross-hatched with another layer, pounded gently and pressed under heavy stones. The sap of the plant binds the layers together. Once dried in the sun, the sheet becomes smooth, pale, and durable. A single roll might hold 1,000 words. The process is simple but almost alchemical. A reed, once living in water, becomes the vessel for immortal words. Egyptians believed this transformation mirrored the cycle of life and rebirth itself. The same river that gave them sustenance also gave them memory. Back inside the temple, the papyrus sheets are stacked carefully and labeled by category: rituals, medical recipes, hymns, astronomy, and the endless lists that sustain bureaucracy. The House of Life is not only a spiritual center, but an administrative one. Within these scrolls lie the blueprints of empire: tax records, census rolls, lists of workers, and temple inventories. Without these archives, the kingdom would lose its shape. And yet, beyond all the ledgers and rituals, something else glows quietly here: a deep respect for knowledge itself. The Egyptians saw writing as a form of protection against chaos. In their cosmology, the universe was always on the edge of disorder, and it was through precise language, through ritual and record, that harmony was maintained. Each scroll, each inscription was an act of balance. You pause by a wall covered in hieroglyphs, figures of birds, eyes, suns, and serpents. Each sign is tiny and perfect, as though carved by patient gods. Hieroglyphic writing isn't read, it's experienced. The symbols shimmer between sound and picture, between what they say and what they mean. A hawk is both the word for sky and the embodiment of the god Horus. A spiral is both a rope and the concept of eternity. Reading them feels less like decoding and more like dreaming awake. Sometimes, in the stillness of night, scribes from the House of Life would step outside and look up at the stars. They called themselves servants of Thoth, keepers of sacred language. Many were astronomers, healers, and philosophers all at once. To be literate in Egypt was to belong to a quiet elite, bound not by wealth but by intellect and duty. One ancient scribe left behind a note that has survived thousands of years. It reads, "Man decays, his corpse is dust, but a book makes him remembered in the mouth of the reader." You linger on that thought. It's not just poetry, it's faith. To write is to defy oblivion. To copy the words of another is to breathe them back into the world. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the murmurs of instruction. In the corner, an elder scribe is teaching an apprentice. The young boy traces symbols in black ink, his brow furrowed. The teacher corrects him gently. Each line is a prayer, he says. Each mark a bridge between heaven and earth. The boy nods, not yet fully understanding, but he will. All scribes do, eventually. Nearby, you notice something unexpected: a locked wooden chest. Inside are scrolls deemed too sacred or too dangerous for public use. Spells from the Book of the Dead, hymns that summon divine presence, formulas for healing, instructions for the weighing of the heart after death. This is knowledge with edges. To open these scrolls is to stand too close to the gods. As you leave the temple, the sound of the Nile returns, steady, rhythmic, eternal. The papyrus fields glow gold under the setting sun. You realize that these houses of life weren't just libraries, they were laboratories of meaning. They preserved medicine, mathematics, astronomy, law, and myth, all woven together. When we think of ancient Egypt, we think of pyramids and mummies, but their true monuments were words, black ink on fragile reeds, outlasting empires. A few fragments have survived. In museums today, small pieces of papyrus rest behind glass: contracts, poems, love letters. One, written by an anonymous lover, reads, "I belong to you like the tree belongs to the earth." It's over 3,000 years old, yet somehow it feels recent. The House of Life, it seems, is still open. You sit for a moment at the edge of the water. the river sliding past in endless repetition. The papyrus plants rustle softly. Somewhere across the centuries, a scribe dips his brush again. The ink gleams darkly, the symbols unfurl, and the voice of Egypt continues its whisper, slow, patient, and enduring. Perhaps, you think, that's the true secret of these early libraries. They didn't just store information, they stored intention, the desire to remember, to give shape to silence. Every scroll was a promise to the future, and somehow, across millennia, that promise was kept. You breathe in the warm air, and for a moment, it feels as though the Nile itself is writing, a long, slow sentence that never ends, flowing between the living and the dead, between forgetting and remembering. The wind carries fine dust across the courtyard, a golden mist that dances in the sunlight before settling softly on everything. You brush it from your arm, but it clings like time itself, unshakable, gentle, eternal. The air here feels older than memory. You've wandered from the temples now, deeper into the quieter corners of Egypt, where the work of preserving knowledge becomes both an art and an endless battle against the elements. Scrolls and sandstorms, two eternal forces locked in a slow, quiet duel. You step into a small workshop near the edge of a village. It's not much to look at. Mud brick walls, an open doorway, the smell of resin and oil. But inside, it holds the heartbeat of Egypt's intellectual life. This is where papyrus is cut, pressed, glued, and rolled. It's where the thoughts of priests, kings, and physicians are wrapped up tight and stored against time's decay. The artisans here work silently. You watch as one man unrolls a long strip of papyrus that gleams faintly in the afternoon light. He weighs it down with smooth stones, then takes a thin reed pen and begins to check the surface. Every sheet must be perfect. Too rough and the ink will blot. Too smooth and it won't hold the stroke. A soft hiss escapes his lips as he breathes on the page to test the fibers. He nods in satisfaction and moves on. The smell is peculiar, sweet, earthy, faintly metallic. It's the smell of words in their raw form before they've been spoken or written. Outside, a hot gust blows through the doorway, scattering grains of sand across the floor. The man sighs. He'll have to clean them up again later. Sand is the eternal intruder here, the uninvited archivist. You move deeper inside, where finished scrolls lie in neat stacks. Some are labeled with short ink marks, names, titles, prayers. Others are blank, waiting for stories. The oldest among them are already brittle at the edges. You imagine them hundreds of years from now, curling into silence under the desert's breath. Historians still argue whether Egypt's dry climate was a blessing or a curse for preservation. On one hand, it kept papyrus from rotting. On the other, it turned everything fragile, breakable, ghost-like. You hold an imaginary scroll in your hands, perhaps one from 1300 BCE, perhaps one that recorded a poem to Ra. You unroll it gently, and the fibers whisper like dry grass. The desert outside hums, low and endless. Papyrus wasn't just a writing surface, it was an ecosystem. It grew only in the delta, where the Nile split into countless green veins. The plant's roots stabilized the soil. Its stalks provided material for boats, sandals, even food. But its highest purpose was literary. The Greeks later called Egypt the mother of books, and they weren't wrong. Without papyrus, there would be no scrolls, no libraries, no history as we know it. You can almost picture the trade routes stretching outward like sunbeams. Papyrus rolls loaded onto barges, floated downriver, then shipped across the Mediterranean. Some end up in the hands of priests in Thebes, others in merchants' chests in Byblos. others still in the curious hands of scholars in Athens. Egypt's wisdom traveled not just in language, but in paper. One scribe, let's call him Amenhotep, because there were always Amenhoteps, sits cross-legged in the corner, carefully copying a medical treatise. His reed pen moves with slow precision as he transcribes the Ebers Papyrus, a collection of remedies and incantations. The papyrus, a real one from around 1550 BCE, contains more than 700 prescriptions from toothaches to snake bites. You lean closer as he mutters to himself, "Crush garlic, mix with honey, apply to wound." Practical magic. Then, without missing a beat, he recites a line to drive away evil spirits. Because in this world, healing the body and soothing the soul are one and the same. The Egyptians never separated medicine from religion. They healed with both hands, one holding a scalpel, the other a prayer. Another artisan nearby is tasked with sealing finished scrolls. He rolls them tightly, ties them with flax string, and brushes the edges with resin. Once dry, they're stored in wooden boxes, labeled with ink that will fade but never vanish. Each scroll is a small miracle of patience. Each one is a bet against oblivion. And yet, the irony is that Egypt's libraries were always vulnerable. A single spark, a flood, or a careless beetle could destroy years of work. Sand, humidity, insects, all conspired against permanence. That's the quiet tragedy of these early archives. They knew, even then, that they couldn't win. They preserved anyway. You step outside again. The air hits like an oven door opening. The horizon wavers, a mirage of heat and light. Somewhere, a sandstorm is building, a slow, invisible wall rising from the desert floor. You squint and watch it roll toward the river, a soft roar that seems almost alive. You imagine the fear of ancient librarians as storms like this approached. They would rush to seal the doors, cover the scrolls, whisper prayers to Thoth and Isis for protection. Some of those prayers worked, others didn't. You remember that centuries later, when archaeologists first uncovered these ancient workshops, they found scrolls buried under layers of sand, perfectly preserved. The desert, it turns out, was both destroyer and protector. The same wind that scattered the past also buried it gently, waiting for rediscovery. Among the scrolls found were fragments of stories, poems, even private letters. One fragment reads, "My heart longs to speak to you, yet fear restrains me." It's signed only with a single hieroglyph, a bird in flight. The scholar who translated it called it the world's first unsent love letter. The papyrus had lain hidden for over 3 millennia. Somehow, that feels both deeply human and impossibly vast. Inside another house of life, you picture scholars cataloging texts, rituals, astronomical observations, lists of kings. Each scroll wrapped carefully in linen, stored in niches carved into temple walls. You imagine the dim light of oil lamps flickering over faces bent in concentration. Maybe someone sneezes from the dust. Maybe someone else complains about how papyrus prices are going up again. Because yes, even in ancient Egypt, inflation was a thing. And in the midst of all that seriousness, perhaps a little mischief too. One unearthed papyrus from Thebes, dated around 1200 BCE, contains not sacred hymns or medical formulas, but a list of excuses from lazy apprentices. The ink was bad, the light was poor, the gods distracted me. You can almost hear their supervisor sighing in divine exasperation. Still, the work continues. Scroll after scroll, word after word. The empire expands, collapses, renews itself, and through it all, the scribes keep writing. The act becomes ritual, the ritual becomes memory, and memory becomes history. You turn back toward the desert, the sun dipping low now, casting long shadows over the dunes. The wind cools slightly, brushing your face like parchment against skin. Somewhere behind you, the last scribes of the day are cleaning their brushes, stacking their scrolls, whispering quiet prayers of gratitude. They know their words may not last, but they write anyway. Because that's the heart of it, isn't it? The first libraries of the world weren't built from stone. They were built from intention, from the stubborn, beautiful hope that words can outlive sandstorms, that something fragile can still matter. As the wind rises again, you pull your cloak a little tighter. The horizon fades into a soft blur of dust and light, like ink dissolving into memory. Somewhere in that glow, an old scribe dips his pen, begins a new line, and keeps the story alive, one brushstroke at a time. The next breeze you feel is cooler, salted with sea air and threaded with the distant cry of gulls. You blink, and the desert fades into blue horizon. The Nile has widened into a mouth, and before you stretches the ancient port city of Alexandria. Ships from every corner of the known world crowd its harbor. Phoenician, Greek, Egyptian, Persian, each bearing not only cargo, but something far more precious, ideas. The city hums like a living archive. Everywhere you turn, there's motion. Philosophers in heated debate, scribes carrying scrolls wrapped in linen, students trailing behind their masters with ink-stained fingers and bright, sleepless eyes. Alexandria was not built for silence. It was built for conversation, for curiosity, for the endless pursuit of understanding. And at its heart lies the greatest dream of all, the library. You walk up the marble steps, each one gleaming faintly in the sun. The facade is simple, unadorned, but the scale is staggering. This is no small temple archive. This is humanity's first attempt at a universal library, an audacious effort to gather all knowledge of the world in one place. Inside, the air feels charged, like static before a storm. The guards nod as you enter, and suddenly you're standing in the grand hall of the Museion, the sanctuary of the Muses. Light spills down from high clerestory windows, illuminating row after row of scrolls stacked in niches carved along the walls. The scent is rich and layered, oil, papyrus, a hint of sea salt carried in on the breeze. A scholar passes by, muttering to himself in Greek. Another sits cross-legged beside a scroll, eyes flicking left and right as he copies a text from memory. Near the far wall, a group of students whisper as they compare translations of an old Egyptian hymn. The library hums, not loud, but alive. You reach for a scroll on a nearby shelf, the label written in careful black ink. Herodotus, Histories. You unroll a few inches and read a line about the ancient customs of the Persians. The handwriting wavers slightly. A copy of a copy of a copy. Alexandria scholars were obsessed with preservation, but they also weren't above a little editing. Many texts here were improved to suit Greek tastes. Some might call that scholarship. Others might call it ancient plagiarism. Historians still argue whether the library's mission was pure learning or a quiet act of cultural domination. Either way, the result is astonishing. Legend says the library held hundreds of thousands of scrolls, perhaps 500,000. Each ship that entered Alexandria's harbor was required by royal decree to surrender any books it carried. The librarians would copy the texts and return the duplicates, keeping the originals for the collection. Imagine being a merchant sailing in with your favorite scroll of poetry, only to have a smiling official say, "Thanks, we'll take that." Bureaucracy at its most literary. You wander deeper into the reading chambers. The temperature cools, the light softens, and the faint hum of murmured Greek echoes through the marble halls. Scholars from distant lands are here. Babylonian astronomers, Jewish translators, Egyptian priests, Greek philosophers. Some wear linen, some wool. All wear the same expression of near reverence as they read. In one corner, a man with a sharp nose and patient eyes carefully unrolls a scroll of geometry. His name is Euclid. He's sketching shapes with a reed pen, murmuring axioms under his breath. A straight line may be drawn from any one point to any other. He looks up, squints, then adds, almost to himself, obviously. You grin a little. Mathematicians have always been this way. Half genius, half exasperation. Elsewhere, an astronomer named Eratosthenes is at work. He's comparing the length of shadows in different cities to calculate the Earth's circumference. Without leaving Egypt, he comes startlingly close to the correct number. The man literally measures the planet with 2 sticks and a lot of curiosity. You have to admire that kind of confidence. And then there's Callimachus, the first librarian anyone ever bothered to name. His great contribution isn't a book, but an index. He creates the Penakes, a catalog of the library's holdings, a scroll that describes all the other scrolls. It lists authors, subjects, and summaries, organized alphabetically long before that idea became common. In a sense, he invents metadata. Without him, no one could navigate this sea of knowledge. You notice a small side room where scribes work at long tables. Here, scrolls are being copied, translated, and repaired. The rhythm is almost musical. The scratch of reeds, the rustle of papyrus, the occasional muttered curse when ink smudges. The scribes dip their pens into soot-based ink mixed with gum and water. Every few minutes, one leans back to stretch his shoulders. Their work is endless, their eyes strained, but they are building something monumental, an archive that aspires to immortality. In a nearby courtyard, scholars stroll under palm trees, debating. You overhear snippets of conversation. The stars are divine bodies. No, they are fire. If fire, then what of the moon? Someone quotes Plato. Someone else laughs and says, Plato never saw the Nile. The sound of intellectual disagreement. Pleasant, persistent, productive. This is what the Library of Alexandria was meant to be, a living organism made of argument. Of course, not everything here is noble. The librarians can be territorial, the scholars jealous. The Ptolemaic kings who sponsor the library see it as a symbol of prestige, a monument to Greek power wrapped in Egyptian mystique. The first Ptolemy, a general under Alexander the Great, built this place to outshine Athens. Knowledge, as always, doubles as propaganda. Still, you can't deny its beauty. The light, the air, the endless murmur of thought. It feels eternal. You sit by a window overlooking the harbor. Below, ships sway gently, their sails painted with foreign emblems. You imagine each one carrying its own little universe of stories. Somewhere in this sea of scrolls might be lost plays of Sophocles, vanished epics, forgotten maps of lands that no longer exist. And maybe, tucked into a dark corner, a love letter or two. Because even among the divine hymns and philosophical treatises, humans will always sneak in something soft, something personal. A scribe's doodle, a note that says, "Gone to lunch." As the afternoon fades, you notice the light deepening to amber. Shadows stretch across the marble floor, touching the scrolls with gold. The sea breeze stirs again, carrying faint laughter from the courtyard. For now, all feels peaceful. But you can't help sensing the fragility beneath the grandeur. Paper, no matter how carefully kept, burns easily. And though no one here knows it yet, the Library of Alexandria will not last forever. Some say it will fall to Julius Caesar's fire. Others blame later conquerors. Some even claim it slowly decayed, forgotten and replaced by newer buildings. Historians still argue whether it ever truly burned or simply faded, one scroll at a time. You close the scroll in your hands and place it gently back on the shelf. The papyrus crackles faintly as it settles into place. You take a deep breath, the scent of ink, resin, and salt. This is where the dream of total knowledge reached its peak, shimmering for a brief, impossible moment before dissolving into myth. As you walk back toward the entrance, the setting sun turns the sea into liquid bronze. A few scholars linger by the steps, deep in conversation, unaware they're standing at the edge of legend. You smile. For now, the library still stands. The words are still safe, and the air is filled with the quiet promise that humanity will always, somehow, find a way to write again. You're still in Alexandria, though the air has changed. The salt in it feels sharper now, tinged with smoke that doesn't belong to the sea. The sun is setting behind the lighthouse on Pharos Island, casting a long blade of light across the harbor, and somewhere in the distance, a faint, unfamiliar tension hums in the wind. The great library still stands behind you, serene and luminous, but tonight it feels like a living thing that senses its own mortality. It's strange how easily smoke and rumor intertwine. You wander back through the colonnades, past the scholars who are packing up for the evening. Scrolls are being tied, lamps lit. One young scribe yawns, muttering that he'll finish copying that text from Aristotle tomorrow. Tomorrow, always such a dangerous word in history. There are 1,000 stories about what happens next. Some say the end begins with Julius Caesar in 48 BCE, when his fleet is trapped in the harbor during Egypt's civil war. To block his enemies, he orders the ships in the docks burned. The fire leaps from mast to mast, spreading with the kind of enthusiasm only fire ever has. Flames catch on storehouses, then leap inland, racing through the city's lower quarters until they reach the royal quarter, where the library stands. You can almost see it, the orange glow reflected in the polished marble, the sudden roar as scrolls, hundreds of thousands of them, ignite in a heartbeat. Papyrus burns hot and fast, turning centuries of knowledge into ash before anyone can even shout a proper curse. A librarian runs into the courtyard, clutching an armful of scrolls, coughing from the smoke. Another passes buckets in a desperate chain. But the flames are indifferent to their panic. The sound of burning papyrus isn't like wood. It's more delicate, a faint crackle, like rain on dry leaves. You listen, heart sinking, as the world's words turn to whispers. And yet, maybe it didn't happen that way. Historians still argue whether Caesar's fire truly reached the library itself. Some ancient writers claim only the warehouses near the docks burned, those that stored copies of texts waiting to be cataloged. Others say the main building survived, wounded but intact. Later sources insist the library endured for centuries after, continuing its quiet work under different rulers. It's almost comforting, that uncertainty. It means that even in destruction, knowledge resists simplicity. You walk through the imagined ruins, the air thick with smoke and speculation. Perhaps the library wasn't destroyed in a single night. Perhaps it faded, bit by bit, through neglect and war, earthquake and empire. The Ptolemies gave way to Romans. The Romans gave way to Byzantines. Each regime shifted priorities, funding, faith. The library might have died not in fire, but in silence, a slower, crueler extinction. And then there's the second fire, centuries later, when Emperor Theophilus purges the Serapeum, the daughter library built within the Temple of Serapis. By then, pagan learning had fallen out of favor, and the scrolls were seen as relics of an old world. Fanatics stormed the temple, smashing statues, scattering texts, shouting praises to a new god. You stand in that echo, the marble floors covered in fragments, papyrus torn, ink smudged, wisdom trampled under zeal. It's not the first time humanity has mistaken knowledge for heresy, and sadly, it won't be the last. And yet, some scholars whisper that even that wasn't the final blow. Maybe, just maybe, the true end came later still, during the Muslim conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE. A story often retold claims that Caliph Omar, when asked what to do with the surviving books, replied, "If they agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree, they are dangerous. Burn them." It's a haunting tale, but almost certainly a myth, born centuries after the fact. Most historians now believe the library was long gone by then. The story persists, though, because it feels true, because it fits the melancholy symmetry of how we imagine knowledge must perish, in fire, under fanaticism, amid misunderstanding. You pause, watching the waves below crash against the harbor wall. The lighthouse still stands, its beam sweeping across the darkening sea. Somewhere out there, ships carry away survivors, scrolls, ideas, memories. Perhaps a few texts from the library found refuge in other collections, in Athens, in Pergamon, in Constantinople. Maybe they live on quietly, unrecognized, quoted and recopied through centuries. The fire consumes, yes, but ideas, like embers, travel farther than anyone expects. And still, the myths multiply. Every generation retells the story of Alexandria's burning, adjusting the details, shifting the blame. Caesar, Christians, caliphs, everyone takes a turn as arsonist. It's almost poetic how we can't let the library die without ceremony. The myth itself has become a kind of preservation. The real scrolls may have turned to ash, but their loss became a story that refuses to burn out. You walk through the ruins in your mind's eye. The once bright halls are empty now, open to the sea breeze. Sand drifts in through broken windows. A column leans at an angle, the carvings worn soft. But there's a peace to it too, a strange, enduring calm. You can almost imagine the ghosts of scholars still wandering these corridors, whispering to each other across the centuries. One of them looks up as you pass, a woman, perhaps a philosopher or astronomer, dressed in white linen. She's copying notes by lamplight, her face serene. You think of Hypatia, the mathematician and teacher who lived here in the 4th century CE. She taught astronomy and philosophy when the library was already a fading echo of its former self. She was later killed by a mob, accused of heresy for teaching reason. But in a way, she was the library's last librarian, a human symbol of its spirit, knowledge standing calmly against ignorance, no matter the odds. You pause by the harbor again. The smoke has thinned, replaced by a deep blue sky. The stars come out, faint and cold. Somewhere beneath them, the ashes of papyrus mingle with sand. Maybe, if you scooped up a handful, you'd still feel the faint texture of ink. The irony isn't lost on you. For all the effort spent preserving knowledge, the Library of Alexandria is remembered mostly for its loss. Its absence became more powerful than its presence. Its destruction gave birth to our collective fear of forgetting. Every archive, every digital backup, every cloud server owes a small debt to this memory of flame. You close your eyes and listen to the sea. The waves whisper against the stones, the same rhythm as a turning page. Somewhere, a breeze stirs, scattering a few last ashes into the night sky. They spiral upward, glowing faintly in the starlight. Maybe they're not ashes at all. Maybe they're letters, small, drifting fragments of thought, still trying to reach us. Because that's the thing about fire. It doesn't only destroy, it transforms. The scrolls of Alexandria may be gone, but their story burns in every heart that wonders, what if we could have read them? You take one last look at the harbor, where the lighthouse still sends its steady pulse of light across the dark. The wind carries the faint smell of smoke, yes, but also something gentler, something like parchment, ink, and possibility. And as the night deepens, you realize the library never truly died. It just changed form, burned, scattered, and reassembled within every mind that still seeks to know. The smoke from Alexandria fades behind you as you drift north across the blue Aegean. The sea is calm, rippling like silk under the slow rhythm of oars. Somewhere along this coast, philosophers argue in shaded courtyards. Students nap through lectures about virtue, and scrolls change hands in dusty little shops that smell faintly of olive oil and ambition. You arrive in Athens, not the heroic city of marble temples and conquering hoplites, but a quieter, slightly weathered one. The golden age has come and gone, yet the echo of it lingers in every cracked step of the agora. You can almost hear it in the murmur of debate drifting through the colonnades, the hum of people still chasing wisdom as if it were the last warm loaf of bread in town. You wander among them, passing a man in a worn cloak reading aloud from a scroll, while a few students nod as though they understand. Somewhere behind a fig tree, another teacher is loudly insisting that the soul can be measured like geometry. He might be wrong, but he's impressively confident about it. You realize that Greece has done something curious with the idea of a library. It hasn't built vast archives like Egypt or Mesopotamia. Instead, it has turned the world itself into a living library, one filled with voices, debates, and the comforting chaos of human thought. Still, the Greeks do keep written collections, though they're less about preservation and more about conversation. Philosophers like Aristotle and Plato use scrolls as extensions of their arguments, like paper companions. Aristotle, in particular, is a hoarder of ideas. His school, the Lyceum, houses what many consider the first true research library in Greece. You imagine walking through it now. The air smells faintly of wax and parchment glue. The shelves are simple wooden racks lined with tightly rolled scrolls tied with colored strings. There's no grand marble architecture here, just practicality and order. A student passes by, carrying a handful of texts labeled with Aristotle's tidy hand, on animals, on dreams, on meteorology. He mutters under his breath about having to copy another entire treatise by tomorrow. You resist the urge to tell him about modern printers. One mainstream historical fact you learn is that Aristotle's library became legendary even after his death. His student, Theophrastus, inherited it, adding his own writings until the collection grew enormous. Later, those scrolls were said to be buried, literally hidden underground for centuries before being rediscovered and carried to Rome. Some historians still debate whether Aristotle's personal library even survived intact, or whether what we now read are reconstructed fragments from various copies scattered across the ancient world. The truth, as always, is a bit fuzzy, wrapped in dust and mystery. But the Greeks were nothing if not enthusiastic borrowers. They admired Egypt's knowledge and Alexandria's methods. The city of Pergamon, for example, took the Egyptian idea of centralized scholarship and gave it a uniquely Greek flair. There, libraries weren't just warehouses of text, they were salons, spaces for scholars to gather, argue, and probably fall asleep mid-debate. In Athens, you wander into the Stoa of Attalus, a covered walkway where philosophers pace like restless cats. One elderly man is dictating a passage from Homer to a young scribe. He corrects the boy's spelling with the kind of patience that suggests he's done this 50 times already. The Greeks didn't just read texts, they performed them, turned them into shared experiences. Reading aloud was a communal act, a kind of ancient audiobook experience, without the skip intro button. Scrolls in Greece were copied, annotated, and traded among the educated elite. You can picture the awkward scene of one scholar boasting, "Oh yes, I have the latest Sophocles on imported papyrus." Another nods politely while hiding his cheaper local copy. Even back then, collecting knowledge had a hint of snobbery attached to it. One quirky tidbit that always amuses historians: the philosopher Epicurus had his own small library, but instead of stocking it with the usual heavy classics, he filled it mostly with cheerful, optimistic texts, poems, moral essays, and letters from friends. Imagine a library curated not for research, but for comfort reading. You'd walk in and find scrolls titled On Happiness, On Friendship, and maybe How Not to Panic About Death. Essentially, it was the ancient world's self-help section. But knowledge in Greece wasn't just a private pursuit. By the Hellenistic period, cities competed to establish their own public collections. Pergamon and Athens built impressive libraries, inspired by the grandeur of Alexandria, but with a social twist. They became status symbols. To found a library was to announce your city's sophistication, a bit like installing Wi-Fi in every cafe today. You step into one of these libraries, perhaps in Pergamum or Rhodes. The marble floors are cool beneath your feet. Columns rise into a painted ceiling, and niches in the walls hold hundreds of scrolls. Students lean against the pillars reading by oil lamp, their voices murmuring softly as they practice their rhetoric. The smell of parchment, thicker and more leathery than papyrus, mixes with the faint scent of burning olive oil. As you stroll, you overhear a debate between two curators about how best to arrange the scrolls. Should they be organized by author, subject, or perhaps by philosophical school? One insists that order is essential for study. The other argues that chaos breeds creativity. Historians still argue whether Greek libraries actually developed formal cataloging systems or if each curator improvised his own. You smile. Some debates never end. You can't help but think how modern it all feels. The scribes, the readers, the endless discussions about how to store knowledge efficiently. It's the ancient equivalent of someone spending hours renaming folders on their desktop. But beneath the humor lies something tender. These people, long before the printing press or the cloud, are already haunted by the fragility of memory. They know how easily scrolls crumble, how ink fades, how a single careless flame can undo centuries of work. And so they copy and recopy, not because they expect immortality, but because they hope to delay forgetting just a little longer. You wander outside as twilight settles over Athens. The Acropolis glows softly above the city. Somewhere nearby, a chorus practices lines from a play that's already centuries old. The sound drifts across the rooftops like a lullaby of endurance. It strikes you that Greece's true library was never contained in one place. It lived in the minds of its people, in the way they quoted Homer in conversation, debated ethics over wine, or taught geometry by drawing in the sand. Every citizen was a walking, breathing volume. Their ideas were their shelves. Their language was their binding. And that's what makes their influence so lasting. The physical scrolls may crumble, but the ideas, logic, democracy, philosophy, rebound endlessly, like echoes across millennia. Each new civilization borrows a page from their story. You pause under a fig tree near the Lyceum, watching the fireflies rise like sparks in the dark. The night feels warm and timeless. You think of all the voices that once filled this city. Plato musing about the perfect society, Aristotle cataloging every living thing, Epicurus teaching that joy is found in simple friendship. You smile softly. For all their disagreements, they shared one truth: that knowledge isn't just something you store, it's something you live. And as the crickets begin their slow rhythm, you feel the weight of centuries settle gently around you. Somewhere, far away, the ashes of Alexandria still float in the air. But here, in this quiet Greek night, knowledge breathes again, alive, curious, and ever so slightly smug. The Aegean breeze carries you west now, along rocky coastlines and sun-baked hills, toward the rising city of Pergamon. Unlike the grandeur of Alexandria with its sea-spanning harbor and marble brilliance, Pergamon sits perched on a cliff, its streets winding like ribbons of dust. Yet in its compactness, there is ambition. You sense it immediately. A city determined to carve its own niche in history, to challenge the greatness of its Mediterranean rival. Pergamon is small but fiercely proud. You wander through the marketplace, past merchants selling figs, olive oil, and imported papyrus. Scrolls wrapped in linen rest in baskets beside other wares. A merchant notices your interest and chuckles. Careful, these scrolls bite back if you misread them. You grin at his joke, understanding perfectly the pride of anyone who trades in knowledge rather than coins. Pergamon's rulers, the Attalid kings, are ambitious in ways both practical and symbolic. They want a library, but not just any library. They want a library that will rival Alexandria, a temple of wisdom that announces, as plainly as a bell tower, that Pergamon is a city of learning. And so they commission architects, scholars, and scribes to build what will become one of the greatest Hellenistic libraries in the known world. You enter the library itself, a terraced structure of white marble, terracotta roofs, and deep shadowed halls. Scrolls line niches along the walls, carefully organized and preserved. Unlike Alexandria, Pergamon emphasizes control. Catalogs are detailed, order is paramount, and each scroll has a defined home. Scholars move through the halls in deliberate paths, consulting texts, debating interpretations, and taking meticulous notes. You notice that Pergamon's library quickly develops a reputation for innovation. The city becomes famous not only for collecting scrolls, but for improving them. A curious historical fact: when Egypt tried to restrict papyrus exports to Pergamon, the city invented parchment, thin sheets of animal skin for writing. Smooth, durable, and flexible, parchment becomes a technology that will outlast papyrus and transform libraries across the ancient world. In a sense, Pergamon fights back with invention rather than conquest. You stroll past tables where scribes and copyists work in near silence. The air is tinged with the scent of ink and tanning agents from the parchment. One scribe hums softly as he dips his reed pen into a mixture of soot and gum, transferring a medical treatise onto a new sheet. Nearby, a student argues with his teacher about an astronomical calculation. The teacher corrects him with the patience of someone who has spent years copying texts by candlelight. And then, in a quieter corner, you stumble upon the oddities. Pergamum, like Alexandria, doesn't only preserve serious works. There are fragments of poems, personal letters, and a curious collection of riddles. One scroll reads, "If a goat jumps over the moon, will the cheese follow?" You can't help but laugh softly. Even in the most disciplined Hellenistic library, humor finds a way to sneak in. Historians still argue whether Pergamum was ever truly equal to Alexandria. Some say it never reached the scale or influence of its rival. Others contend that its innovations in parchment, cataloging, and scholarly practice made it just as important, if not more enduring. The debate itself feels like part of the city's charm, the endless argument that keeps the memory alive. You wander to the central courtyard, where sunlight filters through trellises of vines. Students pace back and forth, quoting passages, memorizing hymns, and debating philosophy. There is an energy here that is both disciplined and electric, a sense that knowledge is not only collected, but actively lived. You notice one scholar rolling a long parchment across a table, carefully inspecting each line. He pauses, squints at the ink, and mutters, "Well, at least the goats won't chase this one." It's easy to forget that Pergamum isn't just a library. The city itself is a cultural powerhouse. The Attalid kings sponsor art, theater, and medicine alongside learning. You pass a courtyard where physicians are experimenting with remedies from Egyptian texts. Someone murmurs about a treatment for snakebite using honey and willow, curiously similar to a recipe you remember from the Nile. Knowledge flows across borders, traveling like invisible rivers between cities. You pause near a niche containing astronomical scrolls. One chart depicts the constellations with remarkable accuracy for its time. The stars feel close here, almost touchable, as though Pergamon itself were attempting to map the heavens. Scholars debate the motions of the planets, whispering to one another, sometimes arguing so fiercely that you imagine the scrolls trembling in sympathy. Pergamon's rivalry with Alexandria is not simply a matter of pride, it's a demonstration of human ambition. Cities were measured not by walls or armies alone, but by the wealth of their ideas. In that sense, Pergamon succeeds. Though smaller, quieter, and perched precariously on a cliff, it proves that a library is not about size, but intention. The careful cataloging, the innovation in materials, the encouragement of debate, all of these give Pergamon a distinct voice in the ancient world's conversation about knowledge. You wander through the upper terraces as the sun begins to set. The light turns the marble a soft amber, and the shadows of scrolls stretch across the floor. Somewhere below, a young student sneezes from dust stirred by parchment. Another chuckles. A scribe mutters something under his breath about ink that never dries. It's all strangely comforting. The same small human imperfections you've seen across every ancient library you visited. And then you pause at a balcony overlooking the cliff edge. The sea stretches endlessly beyond, shimmering in molten gold. You imagine scrolls sailing from Pergamum to faraway cities, carrying knowledge that will shape civilizations. Some of these scrolls will survive centuries, copied by monks and scholars, woven into the fabric of medieval libraries. Some may disappear, lost to fire, decay, or neglect. But the impulse, the stubborn human urge to collect, preserve, and share, endures. A quirky detail catches your eye, and one of the margins reads, "Do not feed the dogs near the scrolls." You laugh softly, imagining a curious canine sniffing at parchment, perhaps thinking it might taste like chicken. Even in the most rigorous centers of learning, life insists on inserting a little chaos. As twilight deepens, the city settles into a quiet rhythm. You feel the weight of centuries pressing gently against your shoulders, a reminder that libraries are fragile yet defiant. Pergamum scrolls may not have burned in the dramatic blaze of Alexandria, but they face a quieter kind of danger, time itself. The material may decay, the ink may fade, yet every copy, every note, every annotation becomes part of a chain that stretches forward. You take a deep breath of salty sea air and let it mingle with the scent of parchment and ink. Somewhere, a scribe whistles softly as he rolls another scroll. The cliffside catches the last rays of sun, and the library's walls glow faintly in amber. Pergamum may never be as famous as Alexandria, yet in this moment it feels alive, patient, and enduring, proof that the pursuit of knowledge is not only about scale, but about care, curiosity, and a stubborn desire to reach beyond the horizon. The air feels cooler now as you leave Pergamon behind and drift northward across the Mediterranean. The smell of salt, parchment, and distant incense lingers in your memory, mingling with the sun-baked dust of city streets. Time seems to bend, folding centuries over each other, as you find yourself in the quieter world of late antiquity, where the whisper of knowledge takes a new form. The age of scrolls is beginning to fade, giving way to something more durable, more flexible, a format that will carry the words of the ancients into the hands of the medieval world, the Codex. You step into a small workshop in Rome, or perhaps Constantinople, it's hard to tell. The walls are lined with benches, each occupied by scribes laboring over thin sheets of vellum. Their hands are darkened with ink, their robes dusted with chalk and powdered pigments. Scrolls lie in piles nearby, rolled and tied, waiting to be transformed. This is a turning point in history. The scroll is slowly being replaced by the codex, a bound collection of pages stitched together along one edge. It feels familiar, yet revolutionary. The codex offers convenience scrolls never could. You can flip through it, mark passages, carry it easily under your arm without fear of unrolling and losing your place. Scholars marvel at the newfound portability, the durability, the sheer possibility of comparison. Lines of text side by side instead of end to end. One scribe murmurs, "It's like reading a conversation rather than a journey." And you smile, imagining him stroking the spine of a newly bound book like a treasured friend. Historians still argue whether the Codex was invented primarily by Christians, Jews, or Roman bureaucrats. Each group certainly used it, and each had its reasons. Christians, for instance, quickly recognized the Codex as ideal for Scripture. It could hold the entire Gospel, easily referenced and copied for distribution to distant communities. Jews adopted it for Torah scrolls and legal texts, finding it practical for study and transport. The Romans, ever pragmatic, appreciated its efficiency in keeping civil records. You watch as one scribe flips through a scroll of Cicero's speeches, carefully transcribing it onto vellum. Ink flows across the page like a river, black and bold. Margins are wide, ready for notes. A student sits nearby, quill poised, absorbing every stroke. You notice that the transition to codices isn't just technical, it's cultural. The way people read, store, and think about texts changes with the medium. Knowledge becomes more interactive, more portable, more personal. A quirky tidbit, some codices include doodles in the margins, little sketches of faces, animals, even mythical creatures. You smile, imagining a bored scribe sketching a cat yawning while copying Aristotle. Even in the most disciplined libraries, humor sneaks in, leaving tiny traces for future generations to stumble upon. Meanwhile, monasteries begin to play a new role in preservation. You wander into a dimly lit scriptorium, where monks sit in long rows chanting softly as they work. The air smells of candle wax and wet parchment. Each manuscript is copied meticulously, sometimes 2 or 3 scribes working on the same text to ensure accuracy. These monks understand the fragility of knowledge. They know scrolls decay, ink fades, fires happen. But careful copying and binding offer hope against the relentless march of time. Outside, the monastery gardens are quiet. Olive trees sway lazily in the afternoon breeze. You hear the faint clatter of water in a fountain, a sound that almost competes with the scratching of quills. The rhythm is hypnotic, a gentle reminder that knowledge, like life, is nurtured slowly. It's not just about survival either. Codices allow for commentary, for layering meaning. Margins become living spaces for dialogue between past and present. Scholars add notes, corrections, and cross-references, creating a conversation that stretches across decades. You imagine opening a codex centuries from now, reading the primary text, then the scribes' notes, feeling connected to every hand that touched it. One mainstream fact stands out. The codex gradually replaces the scroll by the 4th century CE across the Mediterranean world. By the time of the early Middle Ages, the scroll is almost obsolete, a relic stored in dusty corners of monasteries or libraries that never see the light of day. Yet the scroll's influence persists, in the proportions of the page, in the rhythm of reading, in the mental mapping of narrative as a continuous flow. You pause to consider the irony. Scrolls, fragile and cumbersome, carried the world's earliest dreams of immortality. Codices, practical and elegant, carry the same dreams forward. Both formats are temporary vessels, yet their shape profoundly affects how ideas travel, how they are studied, how they endure. A curious scholar passes by, muttering about the difficulty of copying Homer correctly onto a codex. The scroll allowed for a rhythm, he complains. This slicing of text into pages disrupts the music. You smile at the persistence of human argument. Some things never change. Historians still debate when and where the codex truly became standard. Was it the practical minds of Roman administrators? The missionary zeal of early Christians? The meticulous monks in distant monasteries? Likely all of the above. What is certain is that the codex becomes the primary format for textual transmission for the next millennium. The workshop grows quiet as the day wanes. You look around at the rows of codices drying on racks, each one a promise. These are more than texts. They are lifeboats for civilization. They hold philosophy, poetry, law, medicine, and prayer. The scribe's labor is invisible but monumental. Every inked stroke is a rebellion against forgetting, a gentle refusal to let the past vanish. You step outside into the fading light. The horizon glows faintly orange, the sky stretching like parchment across the heavens. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls, a reminder that life continues outside the scriptorium. The monks pause in prayer, their chants lingering like echoes of thought. You realize that this moment, the birth of the codex, is a quiet revolution. The shape of knowledge changes, the way humans interact with it changes, yet the underlying impulse remains the same: to record, to preserve, to reach across time. The scroll may fade, the parchment may yellow, but the desire to connect past and future with words endures, as persistent as the wind carrying scents from distant seas. You close your eyes, imagining the journey of a single codex from a scribe's desk in a sunlit monastery, through centuries of careful hands, surviving fires, floods, and wars, eventually resting in some dimly lit modern archive. The text inside may be ancient, yet its journey is ongoing, alive in every mind that opens it. And as darkness descends outside, the scriptorium glows softly with candlelight, a small, patient lighthouse in the vast ocean of human memory, guiding every thought, every question, every whispered hope from one generation to the next. You leave the Mediterranean coast behind and drift inland toward a quiet valley where the hills roll softly into misty forests. Here, in the early medieval period, the world of knowledge has shifted from bustling cities to the secluded, serene spaces of monasteries. The air is damp and earthy, scented with moss and candle wax, carrying a sense of quiet endurance. You walk along a cobblestone path leading to a cluster of stone buildings, simple but sturdy, with red-tiled roofs and small bell towers. This is the kind of place that seems built to outlast the centuries, to cradle human thought in silence and patience. Monasteries are quiet, yet alive. You step through the wooden doors of a scriptorium and immediately sense the rhythm of careful labor, the scratch of quills, the soft rustle of parchment, the occasional muted cough. Rows of monks sit at long benches, each absorbed in copying, illuminating, or correcting texts. Their robes are humble, their hands stained with ink, yet the devotion in their faces is unmistakable. This is a different kind of library, one where silence is both the guardian and the reward. These monks are not merely clerks, they are curators of civilization. They preserve works of the ancients, Greek philosophy, Roman law, medical treatises, biblical texts, copying them meticulously so that knowledge will survive wars, famines, and the slow decay of time. One mainstream fact stands out. Monasteries like Monte Cassino in Italy or St. Gall in Switzerland became some of the most important centers of textual preservation in Europe, holding thousands of manuscripts when the outside world seemed to forget how to read. You notice, however, that the air is not only filled with devotion. There's a gentle human mischief, too. In the margins of some manuscripts, scribes leave playful doodles, dragons, monkeys, even caricatures of fellow monks. One particularly cheeky note reads, "Brother Thomas sneezed on page 3. Forgive him." It's a reminder that even in a life of solemnity, humanity cannot resist leaving a mark of personality, a whisper of humor across the centuries. The work is painstaking. Codices are trimmed, stitched, and glued. Ink is mixed from soot, gum, and water, sometimes tinted with gold or ultramarine for emphasis. Illuminated letters glow with delicate precision. A monk traces a fine line along a margin, whispering a prayer, as if asking the divine for steadiness of hand. You imagine the patience required, not just skill, but devotion, a willingness to spend days on a single page, knowing your work may never be read by anyone you know. The monasteries also create an early system of cataloging. Scrolls are now codices, and codices must be organized. Shelves are labeled, manuscripts numbered, sometimes indexed with tables of contents. Historians still argue how uniform or sophisticated these systems were, but even rudimentary organization is revolutionary. It allows knowledge to survive and travel. Without it, centuries of human thought might vanish in a single neglected attic or forgotten shelf. You wander past the refectory, where monks quietly eat simple meals. The smell of bread and vegetable stew mixes faintly with candle smoke. You see one monk balancing a tray with care, glancing nervously at a scribe who is still copying a medical treatise, snakebite remedies, treatments for wounds, and recipes for herbs. Knowledge here is practical and spiritual, intertwined with the rhythm of daily life. Outside, the cloisters are shaded, cool, and still. You walk along the stone corridors and imagine the manuscripts carried in baskets to distant abbeys, sometimes on foot, sometimes on horseback. Each copy is a lifeline, a thread connecting the wisdom of the past to uncertain futures. Some codices will survive centuries, others will be lost to damp, fire, or simple neglect. Yet each effort strengthens the chain. Monasteries sometimes compete to acquire rare texts. If one abbey gains a precious Greek manuscript, others will request copies. Occasionally, scribes are sent on journeys, walking days or weeks to acquire texts from other monasteries. It's a quiet, intellectual diplomacy, a network of shared curiosity and reverence that stretches across Europe. You pause to watch a monk testing ink on a scrap piece of parchment. One drop bleeds through, and he mutters something softly in Latin. You smile because you recognize the universality of mistakes in human labor. Even in centuries past, perfection is elusive. Yet each imperfection carries history within it, evidence of a living hand, a witness to human perseverance. In the dim evening light, the scriptorium quiets further. The monks gather in the chapel to chant vespers, their voices rising in harmonic cadence. You hear Latin, Greek, and sometimes Hebrew or Syriac, the languages of the texts they guard. It's a sound both sacred and scholarly, a reminder that preservation is not just technical, but spiritual, an act of patience and devotion intertwined. And yet, these quiet guardians of knowledge are acutely aware of fragility. Fires, raids, and decay threaten everything. One unlucky evening could undo decades of labor. Yet the monks persist. They know that each copied codex, each careful annotation, each illuminated letter is a small defiance against the impermanence of human life. You step into the cloister garden as twilight falls. Olive trees sway lazily, and the soft smell of herbs fills the air. A lone owl hoots from the belfry, and a gentle wind carries a hint of the outside world. Market sounds, distant bells, the faint laughter of children. The monastery, insulated yet connected, feels like a heartbeat of civilization itself. Some manuscripts carry practical knowledge, agriculture, medicine, astronomy, while others preserve philosophy, literature, or poetry. All are treated with equal care. A single scribe may spend months on a legal text or a theological treatise, knowing that each line he inscribes might be the only surviving copy centuries later. There's a quiet heroism here, a devotion not to fame but to endurance. You notice the smallest details, the careful folding of vellum, the faint tracing of ruled lines to guide handwriting, the occasional correction made in faded ink. Each codex becomes a testament not only to human thought, but to human persistence. Margins are decorated, notes appended, mistakes corrected. A living conversation across time. As night deepens, you stand in the center of the cloisters, the echo of the monks' chants lingering like a soft echo of thought. The codices lie resting in their niches, glowing faintly in lamplight. Outside, the valley darkens, the wind carrying the faint rustle of leaves and distant river sounds. The world beyond the monastery may be turbulent, chaotic, even destructive, but here, knowledge sleeps under patient care, waiting to awaken in the minds of future generations. You feel the quiet continuity of human endeavor, from clay tablets to scrolls, from codices to printed books yet to come. Each innovation builds upon the last, each scribe a link in a chain that stretches through time. The monasteries are humble, sometimes invisible, but they are crucial. Without them, the words of the ancients, Greek philosophers, Roman historians, Egyptian priests, might have vanished completely. And as you step outside into the still night, the stars glitter faintly above. Somewhere in the monastery, a candle flickers, and a scribe dips his quill into ink once more. You realize that the pursuit of knowledge is not always about grandeur or glory. It is about patience, devotion, and the quiet courage to preserve what might otherwise be lost. The soft, cool night air carries you forward, leaving the quiet monasteries behind. The world is shifting again. You can feel it in the cobblestones beneath your feet, in the faint smell of baked bread and wood smoke from distant towns. You arrive in the late medieval period, where learning is beginning to burst out of cloistered walls and enter the wider world, the age of universities. The streets of Bologna, Paris, and Oxford are alive with students trudging to lecture halls, carrying bundles of parchment, their shoes kicking up dust as they chatter in Latin, French, or English. You step into a courtyard bustling with activity. Scholars pace back and forth, debating fiercely in the open air, while scribes scurry with messages, lecture notes, and recently copied texts. The universities have transformed the pursuit of knowledge from the isolated devotion of monasteries into a more communal, dynamic enterprise. Here, learning is public, structured, and increasingly formalized. You notice the lecture hall itself, a high-ceilinged room with benches ascending like theater seats. The professor, clad in a long robe, speaks from a wooden podium, lecturing on Aristotle's metaphysics. Students furiously jot notes on parchment, translating and copying passages as best they can. The room hums with intellectual energy, the air thick with ink dust, chalk, and the faint scent of wood polish. The first universities, like Bologna and Paris, emerged in the 11th and 12th centuries, originally as guilds of students or masters. Bologna specialized in law, Paris in theology, while Oxford and Cambridge would later become centers for liberal arts and sciences. These institutions formalized curriculum, examinations, and degrees, creating a new architecture for knowledge, one that allowed ideas to be transmitted, critiqued, and expanded systematically. You walk past a student arguing with a professor about logic. "But master," he protests, "if the premise is flawed, the conclusion cannot stand." The professor strokes his beard, muttering something in Latin about definitions and syllogisms. Historians still argue whether the medieval curriculum prioritized memorization over original thought. But walking among these students, you feel the spark of intellectual curiosity in every raised eyebrow, every scribbled note, every whispered counterargument. The libraries of these universities are small but purposeful. Wooden shelves groan under the weight of bound codices, many copied by monks decades earlier, others imported from Italy, France, or even the remnants of Constantinople. Scrolls have largely disappeared. The codex reigns supreme. Students handle these precious books with care, knowing how easily a dropped corner or a spilled candle could erase centuries of thought. Some students, in attempts to speed up note-taking, develop a form of shorthand, tiny symbols scribbled in the margins to stand for common words or phrases. You imagine a medieval version of texting, but with quills and ink and a much higher risk of smudged meanings. Some notes are so cryptic that modern scholars puzzle over them still, trying to decode the shorthand logic of long-dead students. Outside the libraries, debates spill into courtyards. You overhear one about ethics, another about natural philosophy. Students pace in circles, gesturing wildly with their hands, quoting Aristotle, Avicenna, and Boethius. Sometimes they pause to look at the sun through a small window, calculating angles, or to measure shadows across the stone floor, an echo of the same scientific curiosity that once filled the libraries of Pergamon. Knowledge has moved into a more social arena, a collective performance of intellect. You wander into a lecture on medicine. The professor explains Galen's anatomy using a large codex filled with illustrations of muscles and veins. Students lean in, tracing the lines with their fingers, memorizing details that will help them in future practice. You notice one student whispering notes about herbs, remedies, and surgical techniques. Practical knowledge traveling alongside theoretical learning. The transmission of knowledge is alive and intertwined, a blend of head and hand, of theory and application. Historians still argue whether these early universities truly fostered innovation or merely preserved and transmitted knowledge. Perhaps both. Walking among the students and masters, you feel the curiosity, the debates, the enthusiasm. It's a living laboratory of the mind. Ideas are no longer confined to isolated shelves. They are performed, argued, and refined in the public arena. By the 13th century, universities had developed degree programs, grading systems, and codes of conduct for both students and masters. This formalization allowed knowledge to spread more systematically across Europe, creating networks of learned men and women who could carry texts, interpretations, and methods from city to city, from country to country. You pause in a quiet corner of a library, tracing your fingers across a spine bound in faded leather. The codex you touch has traveled far, perhaps copied in a monastery, perhaps annotated by a scholar in Paris centuries ago. You feel the weight of its journey, the countless hands that have carried it, the countless minds it has touched. And yet, for all its structure and organization, the university world is still full of quirks and unpredictability. Students whisper rumors, hide notes in desks, argue over interpretations with stubborn fervor. One scribe sneaks a joke into the margin of a medical text. Beware the teacher's gaze, for it sees all mistakes and most snacks. The echoes of human personality persist, subtle but enduring, alongside centuries of serious study. As dusk falls, you step out into a courtyard. The sun turns the stone steps a soft amber, the shadows stretching long and calm. Somewhere, a bell tolls for evening vespers, mingling with the distant chatter of students. You breathe deeply, feeling the energy of a place alive with thought, debate, and curiosity. A world where knowledge is no longer hidden behind monastery walls, but displayed, discussed, and passed forward. Universities, you realize, are not just buildings or institutions. They are living networks of curiosity, persistence, and human collaboration. They represent the evolution of knowledge, from clay tablets to scrolls, from codices to classrooms. The impulse is the same: to record, to preserve, to transmit, and to question. The setting may have changed, but the human thirst for understanding remains constant, stretching across centuries as insistently as the sun arcs across the sky. You glance around the courtyard one last time. Students rush past, some laughing, some murmuring serious commentary. You notice a scribe carefully annotating a philosophy text, leaving tiny doodles in the margins, dragons, stars, and perhaps a mischievous cat or two. Even here, humor and humanity thread through the pursuit of knowledge, a reminder that learning is never purely solemn. The medieval evening settles. The lanterns flicker softly, and you feel the continuity of centuries pressing gently against your consciousness. Knowledge is alive here, robust yet delicate, structured yet playful, a reflection of the enduring human desire to capture, hold, and share the light of understanding across the ages. You leave the cobblestone courtyards and lecture halls behind and drift forward into the 15th century, a world poised on the brink of transformation. The air smells of fresh timber, ink, and the faint acrid tang of molten metal. You find yourself in a modest workshop in Mainz, Germany, where a man with determined eyes and ink-stained hands is about to change the course of knowledge forever, Johannes Gutenberg. Around him, wooden frames, movable type, and sheets of hand-pressed paper create a symphony of human ingenuity, quiet yet revolutionary. You step closer to the press, listening to the rhythmic clunk and hiss as letters are arranged, inked, and pressed onto paper. One press operator mutters, "If only the monks could see this, they'd faint at the speed." It's true. The meticulous copying of codices, which once took months, can now be done in days. And not just one copy, but dozens, hundreds, perhaps eventually thousands. The very shape of learning is about to change. Gutenberg's invention of the movable type printing press around 1440 allows for the mass production of books, revolutionizing the distribution of knowledge. What was once the painstaking work of individual scribes now becomes reproducible at scale. Suddenly, texts are no longer confined to monasteries or university libraries. Ideas can travel, cross borders, and reach the hands of merchants, scholars, and curious minds far beyond the elite few. You wander among the newly printed sheets of the Latin Bible, marveling at the crisp clarity of the letters. Each page feels almost alive. You notice tiny quirks in the type. Some letters slightly misaligned, faint smudges of ink, small imperfections that testify to human oversight even in the age of machines. Gutenberg's press is precise, yet it carries personality, the fingerprints of its creators embedded in each printed page. Historians still argue about the immediate social impact of the printing press. Some suggest it caused a revolutionary spread of literacy almost overnight. Others argue the change was gradual, layered over decades. What is undeniable is that Gutenberg sets in motion a cascade, a world in which books are no longer rare treasures, but increasingly accessible tools for education, debate, and personal enrichment. You step outside into a bustling Main street. Students, merchants, and townspeople carry newly printed books wrapped in cloth or stacked carefully under their arms. You see one young boy trying to balance a bundle of arithmetic texts while dodging a cartload of hay. A scholar nearby laughs softly, muttering, "The future of knowledge is heavy indeed." Even in humor, the excitement is tangible. The press has introduced both opportunity and chaos. A quirky tidbit, some early printed books include marginalia suggesting the printers themselves had fun with the medium. A small hand-drawn devil lurks in a corner of one Bible page, grinning at anyone who dares skip a line. Printing, while mechanical, still carries human whimsy. You smile, imagining the same kind of playful interruptions you've seen in monastery margins centuries before. Continuity amid technological revolution. You wander into a small study in Italy, where Renaissance scholars eagerly examine printed editions of classical texts. Latin and Greek manuscripts, previously rare, are now accessible in multiple copies. You imagine a scholar comparing a Cicero scroll with a freshly printed book, noting small variations and corrections. The debate continues, but now with many voices joined in parallel, rather than whispered in one cloistered scriptorium. The printing press also sparks unexpected developments. Maps, scientific diagrams, and medical illustrations can now be reproduced accurately, transforming education and the dissemination of practical knowledge. You watch a teacher unfurl a printed chart of the human circulatory system, a copy easily replicated for students. This is knowledge that travels faster than ever before, carrying the collective wisdom of centuries into classrooms, workshops, and homes. You notice a young woman in a quiet corner reading a printed book in candlelight, a rarity for the era, but a sign of change. Literacy begins to spread beyond monasteries and universities. Knowledge is becoming more democratic, even if slowly, reaching those who previously relied on oral instruction or chance access to manuscripts. The codex survives, yet it is multiplied, amplified, democratized. Historians still argue whether the press alone caused the Renaissance, the Reformation, or the scientific revolution. Likely, it was both a catalyst and a conduit, accelerating changes already in motion. Without the press, however, ideas might have remained local, scattered, and fragile. Now, with type and ink, knowledge is no longer a fragile whisper, but a resounding, reproducible voice across Europe. You wander back into the mind's workshop as evening descends. Lanterns flicker, casting shadows across wooden beams and presses. You run your fingers over the fresh ink of a printed page, feeling the slight texture, imagining how centuries of hands will touch it, annotate it, and pass it along. You think of all the scribes who labored before Gutenberg, their painstaking efforts amplified rather than erased by this invention. Their work persists, now multiplied, traveling across countries, languages, and time. A small note in a printed prayer book reads, "Do not eat the pages, no matter how hungry you are." You chuckle softly, thinking of medieval monks and mischievous students. Human nature, it seems, endures no matter the technology. The press is quieting for the night, but the revolution it begins is just beginning. Books are carried down cobbled streets, into homes, into schools and churches. They cross oceans and borders, often surviving fire, decay, and conflict, just as scrolls, codices, and manuscripts once did. You imagine Gutenberg watching, a faint smile on his face, knowing that the world he touches will never forget, even if he himself fades into legend. As darkness falls, you step outside the workshop and gaze at the rooftops of mines. The smell of ink lingers, mingled with smoke from distant hearths. Somewhere, a bell tolls for evening prayer, echoing over the city, and you realize that knowledge has become portable, reproducible, and enduring. The press has changed everything, yet it continues a centuries-long tradition, the human urge to preserve, share, and illuminate understanding. You take a deep breath of cool night air, letting the rhythm of distant streets and the faint hum of presses settle in your mind. You feel the continuity of human curiosity stretching back through monasteries, codices, and universities. The printed book is just another vessel, a faster, more democratic means of carrying the whispers, arguments, and laughter of countless generations. And as stars appear above minds, faint and persistent, you realize that the press does not simply preserve knowledge, it spreads it. Ideas no longer linger in silence. They travel, they multiply, they invite conversation across space and time. Humanity has learned to amplify its own thoughts, to resist forgetting with every page pressed and every line inked. From Mainz, you drift gently across Europe, following the invisible threads of ink, paper, and parchment that stretch through centuries. The world has changed, yet the impulse to preserve knowledge remains constant. You pass the bustling streets of Renaissance Florence, the quiet cloisters of Parisian universities, and the candlelit workshops of late medieval scribes. Each place a node in a sprawling network of human curiosity. Books, codices, and printed volumes move across rivers, over mountains, and through marketplaces, carrying ideas that will survive wars, plagues, and the passage of countless generations. You pause in a quiet study, the scent of aged paper and leather filling your senses. Manuscripts are stacked neatly on shelves, each one a repository of human thought, philosophy, literature, science, theology. You reach for a codex and open it carefully, marveling at the layers of history within. Notes from a scribe centuries ago nestle alongside marginal doodles, evidence of someone who lived, laughed, and labored long before you arrived. Every imperfection, every smudge, every annotation tells a story as vivid as the main text. Historians still debate the cumulative impact of these libraries, scribes, and presses. Was knowledge truly preserved in a continuous line, or did certain ideas vanish only to re-emerge centuries later? Perhaps both. Walking among these manuscripts, you realize that survival is never guaranteed. Some texts are lost to fire or decay, while others endure because of human determination, ingenuity, and even a bit of luck. Each surviving work feels miraculous, a quiet triumph of persistence over impermanence. You wander into a modern library, a large, airy room filled with shelves stretching as far as the eye can see. The smell of books is familiar, yet subtly different from centuries-old parchment. Cleaner, crisper, yet no less potent. The codices, manuscripts, and printed volumes of the past coexist here with digital screens and microfilm, a continuum of methods aimed at the same goal: preserving, sharing, and understanding human thought. The threads connecting Alexandria, Pergamum, medieval monasteries, universities, and printing presses are unmistakable, woven into every aisle, every book, every page. A quirky detail you notice: one shelf dedicated to the whims of human scribes and printers. Manuscripts annotated with doodles, notes about mischievous cats, and instructions for future readers like "do not drop in water" or "the text may curse you." Even after centuries, humor and human personality persist, echoing the margins of ancient codices and medieval manuscripts. Knowledge is never purely serious. It is living, breathing, and occasionally playful. The journey of these texts reminds you that preservation is only part of the story. Dissemination matters just as much. Ideas from distant lands, mathematical treatises from Baghdad, astronomical charts from India, philosophical dialogues from Greece have all traveled along these networks, copied, annotated, and sometimes transformed. The ancient impulse to record and share is as global as it is timeless. You think of the Library of Alexandria, now lost, yet its spirit carried forward in the manuscripts of Pergamon, in the scriptoriums of medieval Europe, and in the presses of Gutenberg. You pause by a small reading desk, imagining yourself centuries ago, hunched over a manuscript by candlelight. Perhaps you are copying Aristotle, transcribing a medical text, or annotating a Latin poem. Every careful stroke of the pen connects you with generations of scholars, monks, and scribes. They are not ghosts, they are companions. Their presence felt in every line, every margin note, every well-placed correction. You feel the continuity of human thought as vividly as if you were walking alongside them. A mainstream historical fact is that libraries and repositories across time have shaped civilizations, not merely preserving knowledge, but structuring how societies access, interpret, and debate ideas. The codices of the Middle Ages informed Renaissance thinkers, who in turn influenced the scientific revolution and modern scholarship. The human mind, nurtured and connected by these networks of information, evolves in tandem with the tools created to sustain it. You step outside and breathe the air, carrying the faint smells of wood, paper, and ink. Somewhere distant, the ocean laps quietly against shores you've long since left behind. The sun filters through trees, illuminating dust motes that drift lazily like tiny galaxies. You notice a child in the distance, tracing letters in the dirt with a stick, proof that the thirst for knowledge is innate, carried from generation to generation, independent of format or medium. Historians still argue about what constitutes a library. Is it the physical collection of texts, or is it the networks of people who create, maintain, and use them? Perhaps it is both. Each book, codex, or printed page gains meaning only when engaged by a reader, annotated, discussed, and preserved. Knowledge is a living dialogue spanning centuries, cultures, and technologies. A quirky note catches your eye in one of the margins. If you ever find this book in the future, smile and pass it on. You smile, recognizing that despite the centuries and the evolution of media, from clay tablets to papyrus scrolls, from codices to printed volumes, the human desire to share ideas has remained remarkably consistent. Humor, care, and curiosity travel alongside the facts themselves, binding generations together in a shared, silent conversation. You close your eyes and feel the weight of time pressing softly, not as a burden, but as reassurance. The world is vast, knowledge is fragile, yet humanity has continually found ways to preserve it. From the clay tablets of Mesopotamia to the codices of medieval monasteries, from the printing presses of Gutenberg to the digital collections of today, the impulse to record, protect, and transmit endures. Each effort is a bridge across time, linking minds separated by centuries, yet united by curiosity. And now, you settle into a comfortable chair in your own quiet space, aware that the journey has carried you across continents and eras. You sense the rhythm of human perseverance, the gentle hum of generations striving to remember, understand, and pass forward what they have learned. Knowledge is a candle passed hand to hand, flickering yet steady, illuminating paths across the darkness of forgetfulness. Slowly, The pace softens. The images of scribes, monks, students, and printers fade gently into memory. You hear only the whisper of turning pages, the soft scratch of quills, and the distant echo of ideas traveling through time. The weight of centuries feels comforting, like a soft blanket tucked around your shoulders. Remember that every book you have touched, every word you have read, is part of this chain. The knowledge of the world, fragile and resilient, continues to flow through you and every mind that encounters it. There is no rush, no urgency, only the quiet assurance that human curiosity endures patiently, persistently, across time and space. Now breathe deeply, letting the cadence of centuries lull your mind. The libraries, codices, and presses fade like gentle echoes, leaving only the calm certainty that wisdom survives, waiting quietly to be discovered, understood, and cherished. The night settles softly around you, the world hushed and still. You feel the gentle weight of time pressing lightly against your consciousness, not burdensome, but comforting, like a warm blanket or the familiar hum of a fan. The images of ancient libraries, medieval monasteries, and bustling university halls fade into a quiet memory, leaving only the faint echo of turning pages and the scratch of quills. Knowledge, in all its forms, lies patiently before you, waiting to be opened, explored, and understood. You breathe slowly, letting the rhythm of centuries settle into your own heartbeat. From clay tablets to scrolls, codices to printed books, each vessel has carried human thought forward, surviving fires, floods, and the relentless passage of time. And through it all, the impulse remains the same: to preserve, to share, and to connect across generations. The scribes, scholars, and printers of the past are companions in this quiet journey, their labor whispering encouragement and reassurance. Imagine the gentle weight of a manuscript in your hands, the smooth pages of a codex, the crisp ink of a freshly printed book. Feel the hum of curiosity that binds humanity across space and time. The laughter in margins, the playful doodles, the careful annotations. Let the knowledge of the world settle around you like stars scattered across a calm night sky, steady, luminous, and enduring. As your eyes grow heavy, let the quiet continuity of human thought guide you into rest. Each idea, each preserved word, is a thread weaving comfort, curiosity, and understanding. The journey of knowledge is long and patient, stretching backward and forward, and now, for a few hours, you may simply rest within it. End of script. Sweet dreams.